down. Okay. Okay, everybody, let's get started. Sconset Bluff Preservation Fund. And if you're recording, please let us know. And if you could silence your cell phones, I'd appreciate it. We'd appreciate it. We're first going to start with public comment for items not being heard tonight. Seeing not, we're going to go on to the public hearing for the Sconset Bluff Geotube expansion project by SBPF. And
so just before we get started, wanted to apologize to everyone. We had some scheduling conflicts with the third-party reviewer and with George Pucci. If there's anything that's emergencies, we can try to get them by phone. If not, they're both available for whenever we schedule our next hearing. So we need them, that's there. But I think if we discuss the report and have questions in particular, we can pass it on and then have Greg here. And if there's questions for George, we can get those to him as well. I know we have an opinion coming from him on a couple different items, but I don't think we can address those as they come up. Okay. So.
Okay. So we start.
I should also talk.
You should. Right. Hello, Stephen Cohen for the applicant, and hopefully we're nearing the end of our long journey together. Maybe not today, but soon. And I just wanted to give a sort of brief overview of where I think we are, which is that I'm hoping that what will happen today is we can have a review of the peer review report and some discussion of that, and then any other topic that the commission wants to talk about, with the idea that we've basically covered all the major points, so that hopefully next time we could talk about what a condition would, what an order of conditions would look like, whether that's positive or negative, obviously it's going to be up to you, and then potentially close the hearing after that discussion amongst you based on whether or not you determine you need any other new information. So in other words, we're not going to present anything today, and we don't plan to present anything next time unless you ask for it. So that's what I'm hoping we'll have for a program of peer review today, or conditions, positive or negative, and what it would look like next, and then close. Unless the discussion goes wildly some other way. So just to bring you back to where we are, I think most of you know that SBPF has been trying to address erosion in the Stockton area for more than 30 years, and it's used different approaches in different locations for different situations, from dewatering to erosion control to dealing with stormwater drainage and all kinds of ways to try and address it. In the winter of 2012, 2013, we had the first time ever that there was a perception of a catastrophic failure of the Sconset Bluff. In other words, there were such large losses because it was the first time the dunes had eroded enough that the bank was being undermined enough that we had 20, 30, 40-foot losses, even in areas where there had been softer versions of erosion control in place, primarily where there was terracing and other things like that. We still saw massive losses. There was a perception that there would be loss of the historic homes there, loss of the access road, loss of the infrastructure, and we immediately came in with a request jointly with the town for a 4,000-foot rock revetment. The commission spent months going round and round about the 4,000-foot rock revetment, and we came to the conclusion that maybe that we, SBPF, as the applicant and the town, came to the conclusion that that was perhaps not where we wanted to go with it, and we would come back with a separate application for a 4,000-foot geotube installation, because it had the advantage of being a different shape and more easily removable, and had some other advantages. So those were actually tracking at the same time, pending at the same time for a little bit, but we were really only proceeding forward with the geotubes at that time. That process led to a net result of the 4,000-foot project being set aside with the idea that we would do a 3-year pilot program of about 950 feet in the most endangered area, where there's actually no houses, and there was no houses because they were removed or because of the erosion. We are now 5 years into having geotubes in that area, and 3 years into the pilot program with the testing and data collection protocols that you put in place. We think that those were highly successful and have yielded both good data for the project and good data for the commission in general. And what they've shown is that there's been, since this project was installed, in combination with both the geotubes and the vegetation of the bluff and the stormwater improvements that were made at the road and at the top of the bank, that we've seen no erosion of the bluff, no at the top, no erosion on the face, no additional lots of the beach in front, no erosion downdrift in either direction. No additional erosion. Obviously, the natural erosion continues. So the beach has remained walkable at all times during the project, except during major storms and right after major storms, and that's how basically most beaches are in the first place. We've not seen any additional effects or loss of beach because of this project, and we would intend to keep that up. We've seen that there's been no negative impact on the cobble bottom of the beach out in front of the bluff. We've seen no negative impact on the biodiversity in the beach and in the water nearby, or in the wetlands and wetland resources themselves. Essentially no negative impacts, except for I think the northern return. That was the one area where the design flaw was exposed, and we now would go forward with improvements to that design, both in the shape, the materials, the length, to avoid that happening in the future. And we think obviously that's not something we want to lose something to learn from, but a lesson learned. We've also learned that the data being collected was good in a lot of ways, but that there were a few data points that are being over-collected, and there are a few data points that are being collected potentially not at the right times, or not at the best times, and there's a few data points that weren't being collected in the way that would provide you the most useful information. And I think if you look at the proposal, we propose to adjust those to give you, a not cost effective, it's ridiculously expensive, a set of data that is useful to you, and that also does a good assessment of the project, both in terms of impact and failure and successful criteria. The peer review report, which I assume you've all read, I thought was highly confirmatory of what I've just said, and of the key points that we want the commission to take away from essentially this whole project. One of the biggest points that we've heard is your concern about the timing of the sand and the timing of the exposure of the tubes. And Mr. Burns' report, I think, really simply and succinctly addressed both of those points, and and also the sand nourishment formula. And I think if you look at that report, it says that the sand nourishment formula that SBPF is proposing is the state standard and is the correct and best way to do it. It's not the only way to do it, but it's the correct way to do it here. And he also says that based on the system that we have here, that an adaptive formula that will allow us the commission some flexibility and the applicant some flexibility to deal with the long-term impacts here is a good way to go. So we were glad to see that he agreed both with that formula and with the adaptive approach. We were really glad to see that he agreed that the timing of the sand release is not actually the critical issue, it's the volume of the sand. And if you read the report, he says that the beaches in front of the tubes and the beaches downdrift and the dunes downdrift are fed by sand in the littoral system, not by the sand from the bluff. The sand from the bluff is only impactful in the sense that it's a volume of sand being contributed, and he notes that it's only 7% of the length of the bluff is being affected by the project here, and that the sand being contributed is more than the sand that otherwise would have been contributed. So if you take timing out of it, you're both only impacting 7% and you're replacing that sand. So we were glad to see that he agreed with that position that we've been taking. He also pointed out that the geotubes essentially have not only shown no negative impacts, but that they pose no negative risk except during storms after they've been exposed. So there's been a lot of questions about how long were the tubes exposed and what's the impact of that, and there was some question, of are they being covered up fast enough, and we have asserted that it kind of doesn't matter how long they're exposed when there's no storm, because the waves don't get that far. It's a visual impact. We want to see them covered, and it negatively impacts the integrity of the tubes because they would break down from weather and whatever. But from an environmental point of view, having them exposed doesn't have any impact. The impact only exists after they've been uncovered, which they're designed to have the sand wash away. And if you look at the data points that we did submit, you see that it's only 2, 3, 4 days a year where you have the storms washing away the sand and continuing before they're the end of the storm. So we're really glad to see that key data point that he pointed out, which was uncovered during a storm, is a very, very small number of days, and frankly, it's not an impactful number of days when you build in the sand nourishment. If they were exposed continuously, we'd have an issue. But there'd be creating a problem because you have only the storm uncovering on a small number of days and then quickly both recovered and nourishment. We think that there's essentially no negative impact, and Mr. Berman seemed to say the same thing. He also noted that the key trigger for this whole project is going to be measuring the walkable beach, that the littoral system is feeding the sand both downdrift and updrift and in front of the project. In other words, that the nourishment sand or the bluff sand is not what's keeping that beach there, it's the littoral system, but that he didn't think you could contribute. He says it's implausible to contribute enough sand to maintain that beach, and he's right, but he also says that the sand is contributed from the littoral system. And what we think, and what the evidence shows so far, and what we hope it will show long term, is that as long as the mitigation sand is sufficient, the system should keep that beach there in a walkable criteria. And if it doesn't, your conditions already provide for measuring and removal if that happens. So he came to the same conclusion that we did, that you should pre-provide for that situation. SPPF has presented you guys with a lot of data and a lot of scientific conjecture and a lot of legal issues. But what this basically all boils down to is two things. One is there sufficient evidence to show that we've justified the use of a coastal erosion structure here, a CES, in order to have this kind of level of protection? And I think that we have both presented that information, and hopefully you have concurred with that. And then if that's justified, then the question is, are we proposing the best available means? Not perfect, not mimicking nature in every exact way, but the best available means without creating any undue negative impact. And I think that what we have here is a system that has sufficient sand mitigation, sufficient data collection, and sufficient sand nourishment in order to mitigate that with failure criteria and other protocols built into place to prevent sort of a horses out of the barn situation where you can't come back. So I hope that you'll find that we meet those criteria and that you approve this project in the way it's presented, or in some version of it that you think would be appropriate going forward. We're happy to answer any questions that you have. Maria Hartnett, who I know has presented before you for how many years now, Maria?
Many.
Yeah, she'd be embarrassed if I told you, but many. And Dwight Johnson is also here, and they'll go through a little more of the science that you don't necessarily want to hear from me. But I think at the end of this, what we want to get to is, do you have any questions? And if not, hopefully we could go through the process of reviewing an order and closing at the next meeting. Thank you.
Maria Hartnett from Epsilon for the applicant. Just wanted to take a few minutes tonight. As Stephen said, Dwight and I will both be presenting tonight, and I was going to spend some time touching on some of the monitoring data and then talking a little bit about the sand mitigation volume, because I understand, or the sand mitigation procedure, and I do understand that has been one of the key concerns. So I'll spend a little time on that, and then Dwight will present more of an overview of the independent review comments. So, like Stephen, just wanted to go back to when the existing project was permitted. At that time, many of you on the board, those of you that were not, we did spend a lot of time going through potential impacts and relying upon the best data we had at that time and relying upon a knowledge of coastal engineering processes and other predictions. And at that time, we did our best, or to more appropriately say, you did your best, working with DEP as well to appropriately condition that project and to come up with monitoring and mitigation protocols that should be in place. It's so nice where we are now, where that system has been in place for 5 years, and we now have 5 years and it's in its 6th winter, so we now have so much data that we can actually look at and we can use to assess the system and then also to define appropriate monitoring going forward. So you've seen the reports coming in and piling on your desk, and we've done over 16 shoreline surveys, 8 with bathymetry since the project was built. There have been 6 underwater video surveys, 3 aerial bluff surveys, more wetland well monitoring, beach invertebrate monitoring, etc. So from all of this data, we now can make more of an assessment of the project, what's working and what's not working. And what we have seen is that the rates of shoreline change, both in front of the geotubes and in adjacent areas, are not different than what the historical record has shown. So in other words, we're not seeing evidence of accelerated erosion. We're not seeing evidence of harm. That's what we've seen in the data, and that has been confirmed by the independent reviewer. You've come to a similar conclusion. Likewise, there's still a beach out there in front of the geotubes and in front of the adjacent areas. On the returns, again, we've come up with a little better design for the returns. With some of the spatial constraints we had, with a little steeper return on the northern side, the proposal in front of you is for a longer, more angled, more gentle return. So with all that data, again, we're at a place where we can see what's working. Overall, we've seen that the sand mitigation has been working in terms of preserving adjacent beaches. I do want to talk a little bit about template regrading. We've seen that's certainly a lesson learned. We've submitted a protocol for that to you, so I will take you through that. But overall, we have seen that most of the sand has been delivered, things have been covered, and again, we're maintaining beaches there. So let's take a few minutes here now and talk about sand. So we have put forward the mitigation rate calculated of that 8, when you look at this is weighted for the current and proposed project, the 8.8 cubic yards per linear foot per year. We used the same approach that Greg Berman recommended, that height times length times the recession rate. That's where we came up with the 8.8. As you've heard, we also are proposing an adaptive sand mitigation protocol. We do feel that this truly is the best available measure. And we saw in the independent review, there was a comment about making sure you have the right volume out there. So as you've heard at previous hearings, and I just want to take you through this adaptive management protocol. So again, the idea would be to keep that 22 cubic yards per linear foot per year as the refill amount. That allows quite a bit of conservatism. Again, what we've calculated is 8.8. So it's almost threefold more than what's been calculated. But use that 22 and have that be almost your stockpile. So upon the completion of construction, the template will be filled to that same amount. Throughout the winter, as needed, it will be pushed down and regraded. We are not proposing any maximum. So if there is ever a winter where everything that we put out there gets used, more would be added. So I want to make that clear that we don't see 22 as a maximum. Then each spring, after we've done the monitoring and we know how much is there, that would then be refilled prior to the fall, so that every fall we go in with a full sand template. The next thing, so that is what we are proposing. I also do want to talk about a little bit about regrading the tubes. We've provided to you a document that goes through the March 2018. It's a very long memo. I think the most useful part, or a good summary, is the calendar we provided at the end. So this includes the date of every storm, the amount of sand that was provided, etc. And really what I want to touch on that, so I want to take a minute to talk about what happened in March, but more importantly, I want to talk about lessons learned for the current project, for the proposed project that's before you. So we can go into details on this if needed, but again, for March of last year, I just wanted to take you through high level. So what we calculated is that through 3 storms, approximately 5,500 cubic yards of sand were contributed. We had a big stockpile of sand out there in the beginning, about 2,500 cubic yards. There were some sand deliveries between some of the storms. Some of that sand wasn't all the way spread out, but it was available. And so we did some calculations to figure out, even if it's not spread out, how much did we lose? And we came up with about 5,500 cubic yards. So again, it was coming from a single point, but that sand was lost. We took a look at the order, and the requirement in the order was to put out 2 cubic yards per linear foot as a minimum every time the tubes were uncovered. So if you take that 2 cubic yards, calculate it by the length, you come out that the requirement was 5,700 cubic yards. So what actually happened, even though this was a very difficult time with the weather conditions and other logistical factors, is we did get quite close to that, around 5,500 cubic yards. I also want to point out that when we look at 2018 as a whole, we still see that even though in March there were technical challenges getting all the sand out there, on a whole, the sand template still contributed more than the unprotected bluff. So moving on from there, we definitely do feel that there were lessons learned from March with those 4 storms in 1 month. And so we've provided some documentation. I know Jamie has probably explained that and provided memos from Jamie that are included in your packets. But there are 2 big changes that the project is making. First is the project now has its own dedicated piece of equipment, its own bulldozer. Additionally, the project has its own dedicated staff to operate that equipment. And in addition to that dedicated staff, there are also 2 backup operators that can be called upon if needed. And so because of that, we have put in the protocol that sand can be regraded within 10 business days. And under these new conditions where we have our own equipment, we have a designated operator, and we have the template refilled to 22, so we have the full volume available, we do feel that we can get out there promptly after storms and that we have incorporated the lessons learned from March. So I'm going to stop there for a minute and pass it on to my colleague Dwight, who wanted to spend a little more time going through more of the independent review document.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Stephen. Stephen and Maria really hit on a lot of the high points from Mr. Berman's review. You have a document that I think we addressed his comments, so I don't want to read that into the record or anything. I'm going to try to hit upon the high points that were not already addressed by either Stephen or Maria. One of the items that I know we've had discussions about quite a bit during these hearings has been the calculation of the volume of material washed off or eroded off the bluff. Maria has hit upon that, but one of the items that Mr. Berman talked about was measuring mean high water and the recession of the mean high water line versus mean low water. We talked about that, and the process that we used for this project was to look at the recession rate of the bluff itself of the coastal bank and how far the coastal bank moved back, not the mean high water line. And as we've mentioned, there's quite a bit of data, and Mr. Berman's identified that there's a lot of data. That we use those surveys going back to 1994. So depending on the north or south, one measurement, we have the data from 94 to 13, and the other one was from 94 to 17. And we believe that's the best method for calculating the volume of sediment off of the coastal bank, because that's the landform for which we're looking to mitigate the lost material, not the landform at the mean high water line. So that's why we use that approach. To be honest, in the long run, you know, when we're talking about long-term erosional rates, the moving back of mean high water, moving back the bluff, it should all be about the same in long-term erosional rate periods. But that's why we use that calculation, because that's the landform which we're looking to mitigate. Has been pointed out several times already, the littoral system is what maintains this shoreline, the beach and the near shore, and that even the project at its full size, at 4,000 feet, is only about 7% the length of the entire shoreline. Therefore, that's providing the vast majority of sand being contributed to maintain the beach in front of the project. The use of the mitigation sand is to mitigate that volume that would otherwise be protected by the bluff. So that there's no net loss of sediment going into the littoral system. And we've talked about that a lot, and overall, there's plenty of sand being contributed to the system that's greater than what's been measured off the bluff. The other item, which Maria already talked about, kind of the adaptive management being the right volume, because we think that takes care of a year-to-year change in volume of sand that's contributed to the littoral system. So that means rather than being a set number, it's, you know, going back to backfill what was lost the previous year. So it's a year-to-year approach as opposed to one set number that's selected at one point in time. He mentioned about the design, and as we've said, the existing system is essentially a demonstration project. The first 25% or so of the project to be a demonstration project. And we, you know, from lessons learned from changes in design criteria, the proposed project is essentially the same as what has been built and demonstrated to be effective. The minor tweaks in that design are the lowest tier is set at -3 feet mean low water datum as opposed to 0, so it's a little deeper. We make sure that the 4th tier is at a height to be above the height of wave run-up during storms, because if water gets up behind it, as we see with the Coyer systems down beach that are not up at that height, you get the wave run-up over that stabilization, then you get scour behind it and you get erosion of the bank. So we want the system to be effective for the long term, so it's up at a height so that the wave run-up during storms doesn't overtop it, and there's a factor to account for sea level rise. We've already talked about the existing system. Mr. Bergman talked about the 2018 storms. We provided that memo to you. It was prepared by Jamie and myself to present what, you know, in 2018, the lessons learned. We won't go into that in more detail, but the takeaway from that is the existing order has a requirement to provide 2 cubic yards per linear foot of exposed geotube after storms. And although it was not from the length of the geotube, the volume of sand that was released from the delivery point was just about equal to that 2 cubic yards per linear foot. So, and you know, some of that is with an estimate, the visual estimate of that. We had 2,500 cubic yards that was washed away, that was pre-positioned, and the rest of the material we estimated at 60% to be conservative. It was more than half. We selected 60% and then did the math. That's the way it worked out. But you know, the takeaway is that even with those successive storms, some of the logistical issues of getting it spread, the volume was met, which is the important thing. The maintaining the beach, we've talked about that with you know, the length of the material, the length of the project in terms of the total. Mr. Berman also used a figure as an example of a short length bank stabilization project, shoreline stabilization project that was a hardened structure, didn't appear to have any sand nourishment as part of the project, and the adjacent shoreline has eroded out, so it's now protruding out into the shoreline, essentially providing a groin effect. This proposed project with the existing being nearly 4,000 feet is not the same as a groin. We're talking about 0.8 of a mile in length versus his, yeah, I know we use it for, you know, as an example, of kind of an extreme example, but at 4,000 feet, we don't expect to be seeing a groin effect type issue here. It will, you know, be kind of like an undulating or, yes, somewhat of a protruding shoreline from the adjacent. However, with the shallow returns and the sediment beach nourishment, the template re-nourishment, we have sand that's available to keep in front of the tubes and on either ends. So it becomes more of a protrusion of the shoreline versus a groin effect where you're interrupting that flow of sediment. That we'd expect that sand to fill in and keep that shoreline a little smoother because of the shallow returns and the length. Also, as discussed at one of the earlier commission meetings with talking about sediment transport, diffusion of sand off of the template, you know, diffusion kind of goes in all directions. So it also goes, you know, comes off of the returns and goes to the north and south. So through those mechanisms, we don't expect to see a groin effect, as that example showed. And one of the lessons learned here is we do expect to see, you know, the need for return extensions in the future. As definition, this is a bank stabilization project. It only stabilizes the bank that is behind the stabilization project. The shoreline to either end will continue to erode at its natural rate. So over time, there will need to be extensions, and similar to the amended order that was issued for the current project, as presented in, you know, some preliminary draft conditions suggesting a condition that would allow for the installation of those types of extensions in the future as needed. So, you know, in terms of the response to comments, these are kind of the high points. You know, part of the design is that that sand is meant to wash off, you know, to erode off the front of the template and then to be replaced. So that is part of the design, which means there will be times that the tubes are exposed, and that's, you know, part of the design. And, you know, as we discussed in the past, the data that we've seen, we don't see the adverse effect to the adjacent beaches from the project. As provided in the January 4 letter that was submitted to the commission after our last meeting in December, we provided in table 2 that it's probably most applicable to look at the Woods Hole group profiles that are closest to the existing structure, the 2 north and the 2 south. The 2 south, which are profiles 90.85 and 90.8, both show a moderate amount of accretion from the time the project was completed to the most recent survey. So from October 14 to September 18. Immediately to the north, those 2 profiles, 92, which is the closest, showed a minor amount of retreat. Most of that retreat was in the first year, where it lost about 10 feet. From October 14 to October 15, And since then, it's been stable with about 4.5 feet of accretion. And then 92.1, which is the one just north of that, there's been a minor amount of accretion. We start to look at the Woods Hole Group profiles that are beyond those, and because of the longshore sediment transport, because of the various factors that go into shoreline erosion, it's hard to say that, you know, profiles that are 1,000 feet or so from this existing project it's a direct correlation between cause and effect. But these two closest, north and south, are probably pretty good examples of the effect of the template on the immediately adjacent beaches. The mitigate, in terms of making decision, the permitting decision, you know, for a conservation commission, we looked at the design, we talked about the design. The mitigation measures, we talked about the mitigation measures. We provided a template management protocol as to how that adaptive management would be met. Basically, a refilling the tank type analogy. You fill it up at the beginning of the season, keep it covered, and then at the end of the season, do the annual topographic surveys, determine the volume that was lost, and refill it. The dedicated equipment, dedicated staff with backup. And this measure, this adaptive management really is the best available measure, and it exceeds pretty much all other, if not all other projects in the Commonwealth where the conditions are usually a once a year placement of a mitigation volume. And this is a volume that's there that, as we said, is about 3 times the average, and there's no upset, and is to be covered throughout the year. We've reviewed the performance standards. October 1st public hearing. Won't go into the gory detail of the reviewing each performance standards, but these, the alternatives, there have been many alternative projects, or many alternatives evaluated both in practice and in theory. And through the process of the revetment leading to the geotubes and the demonstration of the first 25%, we believe this is the best alternative. The purpose is to protect and stabilize the coastal bank. So that's, you know, one of the projects when it's on coastal bank or the buffer zone, that have no adverse effect on the stability of the coastal bank. The purpose is to protect the stability of the coastal bank. In this case, the coastal bank is also a sediment source, so we have the mitigation measure to provide mitigation sand so that the sediment continues to be released from this reach of shoreline. The purpose is also to protect pre-1978 homes and infrastructure. So we've demonstrated that throughout the process. As we said, that several years of data that then supports that this demonstration project is a good project and used to inform the design and make some tweaks to the design. And we've also presented on November 5th, public hearing, the compliance with the existing order of conditions. With that, as Stephen mentioned, we believe we've met the standard that is in providing all the information that a commission needs to make a permitting decision. We've just run through all those items, specifically compliance with the performance standards. And, you know, with that, we respectfully request effectively closing the hearing, as Stephen mentioned, leaving it open to allow the preparation of a draft order of conditions, hopefully an order of conditions positive allowing the project to move forward. But and then, you know, leaving it open so that if there's additional information as that's being drafted, that information can be submitted to the commission as needed. So with that, we complete the presentation for the applicant and are available for any questions.
Questions? Start.
I guess I don't have a lot of questions per se, but I still, when I read the independent reviewer, it does highlight things like the uncovered tubes having a negative impact on coastal resource areas. You know, the uncovered tubes, again, leading to some flanking and end scour. And I know that you have your own bulldozer now, but I'm still concerned with being able to keep that thing covered during storm periods, because he did say that, yes, when the waves aren't reaching the uncovered geotubes, not much is happening. But we've had actual storms where they were uncovered. So,
and we have acknowledged that. As I mentioned, however, the design, the purpose of the sand is to be washed off during a storm. It's unsafe to try to get out there and recover it during the active storm. But getting out there, I think the order of conditions reads now something to the effect of as soon as possible. I don't have it verbatim, but effectively it's reads something like that. That's why we presented in the protocol a defined time period. But getting out there after the storm, 10 business days after a storm, so that it's covered, so for the next storm. I think March of 18 was a little unusual, having that succession of storms in short, in such short time period between the storms, such frequency. But the intent here is to get them covered within a defined time period as opposed to as soon as possible, so that the sand is there for the next storm. One of the points that we have presented, I forget which letter it was now, it was March 16 or get my years mixed up here. November 5 or November 16 letter, we show that the design shows that the sand in front of the geotubes is about 6.2 cubic yards per linear foot. If the length-weighted average contribution off the coastal bank here is 8.8. That means it's about 2/3 to 3/4 of the annual sand load is washed off the tubes when those upper two layers of geotubes is washed. So the first storm, you're getting 2/3 to 3/4 of the annual load. So then as those get recovered, every other storm that those are getting washed off is getting more sand contributed to the system.
so, and I like that you're doing the sand calculations, but part of it is the actual bluff functioning like a bluff. So in the actual storm, not the sand, but now having a hard object that the wave energy is going to run up to. So even with the sand in the system, I'm talking more about the actual bluff absorbing wave energy versus being a hard geotube reflecting it.
Well, two points on that. One was presented when, again, I think it was October, when the design was presented by Gordon Thompson. The mitigation, the compliance with the performance standards, the geotubes are designed to be stepped back, so it's a slope as opposed to a vertical face. That actually absorbs the energy of the wave runoff versus a vertical face, which would reflect it right back. So that's a design feature meant to mitigate the effects of the exposed geotubes, as opposed to the shoreline that I live next to, where we have vertical seawalls and the spray comes up, it causes those issues. This allows some of the wave runoff. Number two, the returns, as we mentioned, are at a shallow angle versus like a 90-degree. So in terms of the ends, that reduces some of the aiding effect to mitigate those issues. The other point that I want to bring up too is in Mr. Berman's report on page 5. He has a little figure here with times time 1, 2, and 3. Remember, this is a bank stabilization project. The purpose of the project is to stabilize the bank. When we look at the two options here, one is the unprotected bank, and one is the stabilized bank. Time 1, with the stabilized bank, there's sand in front of those tubes being washed away during the storm. Time 2, that storm has caused the loss of the toe, the oversteeping of the bank on the left. On the right, the tubes are there and in place. And then time 3, on the left, the bank then has eroded back, both of the toe and with the toe eroding back, it means the whole thing is going to move back. But time 3, the geotubes is still there. That's the purpose. The project, the need is there's eroding coastal bank, jeopardizing homes and infrastructure, and the purpose is to stabilize this reach of the shoreline. So I understand what you're saying, but we've taken all of the steps in the regulations and in the CZM policies that are used in conjunction with the regulations to be the best available measure in terms of the design, with the slope, the sand, to mitigate the sediment volume, and then the height of the return, or the height of the geotubes to prevent overwashing and the erosion of the bank on the back. One of the items on the design during the commission hearings, someone talked about maybe replacing that 4th tier with Hoyer rolls. And that's not proposed because Hoyer rolls need to be anchored into the substrate. Typically in this type of a situation would be ductility. That would damage the 3rd tier and keep, make that so that it is no longer, the integrity of that tier would be damaged. So we've kept with the 4th tier, being tier 2.
I'd like to be done, Ashley. Can I jump in?
Yep.
First of all, I disagree that that slope is exactly what you said is, because if you go out there and look, especially as that lower bag starts to get exposed, it actually kind of bows out and then up. And when the waves are hitting, really it's probably worse than a vertical surface because it's hitting a surface that's angled out. And I think that probably increases reflection, not absorbs it. So I think, and I think, as the reviewer points out, as soon as those bags are exposed, it's acting like any other hard, smooth coastal engineering structure, which it is. And I think we saw N-scour on both ends of that structure, not just, I know they're laying it all on the clay knob as the cause of all their problems up there, but the other side had N-scour too, but that's where they dumped all the sand over and it got covered up very fast after last winter. And then I still don't like your adaptive mitigation, because basically what you're saying is, oh, we've got 6 yards there, that's the average amount, but in the storm year, you lose way more than that. Again, let's go back to Sandy, that thing that started this whole thing going. You had areas that lost 30 foot of bank, which means you lost more than 1 cubic yard of sediment for every foot of elevation, and you have a 60-some foot average elevation bank. That means in places you were losing 60 or 70 cubic yards per linear foot in one winter. And you talk about having all that sand, how important it is to have the sand in the littoral system. Well, you got to count it, you're building a structure tall enough to withstand the 100-year storm, but you're mitigating it for the average. And you need to mitigate it for what you're building it for, I think, because you're expecting it to be there for that storm. And we have the right to expect the mitigation to be there for that storm too, as do your neighbors. So I think, when you lose a certain amount of sand, that's great, but then that's how much you're going to lose unless you get a really big storm and it does get up to the top and starts taking it off the top. And yeah, you've got your own bulldozer, but now you've got 4 times as much area to work as well. So I'm still not convinced that you're going to be able to replenish it. And if say you have a really bad year and all the sand comes off the top and now you've got to bring in sand to refill the top, where are you going to get that much sand and how are you going to get it out there if we have all these successive storms and you're bringing it over on a barge and nobody's running because the waves are too big out there? I have all kinds of problems with your mitigation. I'm not satisfied.
Let me, as we said many times, with the front there with the 6 cubic yards, identifying the amount of sand that's there at the beginning of the first storm of the season. That's what's there. And then after each storm, there's 22 cubic yards per linear foot available on the template. So that's almost three times what's lost in an average year. So it's there to replenish that front after each storm event. The extended project being about 8/10 of a mile. Once we have all the sand there in the fall, as the winter goes on, that length of template can recover, the bulldozer can recover the exposed geotubes in one working day. Just, Jamie can go into detail, but just think about, a bulldozer traveling 2 miles an hour to push the sand to cover it, then it backs up at 2 miles an hour. It can make several passes in one working day to get that front covered. So in terms of the longer project, and the ability to recover it in a working day when the template is full is very plausible and doable. As we mentioned, there is no upset limit, but in terms of monitoring sand during the winter, I think the operators can keep track of and see how much sand is there, and if they're going to need more. It's now the middle of January, and they perceive that there would not be enough for 4 or 5 more storms. They can bring in more. But I think to think that it would be operated until it was bare and then bring on more sand is not practical, because you want to maintain a minimum depth of sand over those to protect the tubes from the equipment. So I think in terms of the regulations and the best available measures, that the standard has been in Commonwealth with DEP and CZN, the average annual rate, the average annual volume. If we have more than the average annual volume, one supposed to be stockpiled in situ on the template to be available to provide that volume, much more than the average annual. So it exceeds what the regulations require, and we think meets the definition of best available measure.
Well, Mr. Chairman, so you see, forgive me, but I sort of feel you've contradicted yourself in a sense by saying that you're going to go to the minimum as you feel required by the state, i.e. the 22 cubic yards per foot, which all of which won't be available in the event of a storm, because you're going to need to protect the top of the geotubes. So why not have the 22 cubic yards, which certainly from what Ernie is saying doesn't sound enough, assuming you could run the bulldozer during a 100-year event. But from your point of view, why not have the extra amount on the geotubes? I mean, I'm a bit puzzled that you wouldn't.
There is the extra amount on the geotube.
More than 22 cubic yards?
No, the state requirement for DEP and CZN would be the average annual, which would only be the 8.8.
But
the template has nearly 3 times that, 3 times more than what would be normally required by DEP. So therefore, there's plenty of sand on there to recover exposed geotubes. And
I understand all that, and while I don't want to be rude in interrupting you, it seems we're going around in circles here.
we have them.
So, so that seems a futile line of questioning from my point of view. I'd like to say that the photographs that I provided, which are on the website under 2018 NOI, they were photographs that I took between March the 4th and March the 16th. And images 8 through 12 really contradict what you're saying about there being sand available during the storms of the 3rd of March, the 8th of March, and the 13th of March. And adding to Ernie's observation about how much end scar there was, particularly on the southern end, it was really significant. So at the end of those storms, the peninsula effect, it was probably sticking out 25, 30 feet, although I didn't actually use a tape measure, but the pictures I've got there show a companion of mine standing next to it to give you some idea of the perspective. And the sand that you're talking about being delivered, which as far as I saw, and I was out there every day, didn't contribute anything to those 3 major storms. And in fact, Hoyt's Hollow lost its ramp completely. And so when I came down on the 16th, the ramp had been rebuilt. The sand ramp had been rebuilt at Hoyt's Hollow, and sand was starting to be delivered over the southern end on the bluff, which is my last picture, I think, in those pictures that I sent. And then before this is open to the public, Mr. Chairman, I have some questions for Steve Cohen, but perhaps if other commissioners have questions for Dwight.
Well, I just had one other question, because I know I asked at some point this fall about how this geotube configuration was going to handle sea level rise in the future. And I think that as well was pointed out by the independent reviewer, that any project in this location really, needs some future plans, some true trigger criteria. With loss of the beach was saying this thing is just getting removed, when we hit this point. And I don't know that any of that has really been presented or discussed.
As presented in the September 17 hearing, the first hearing, and followed up by Gordon Thompson's review of the design. The height of the geotube system was designed based on the wave run-up for the current 100-year, plus an extra factor, I forget now off the top of my head whether it's 1 foot or 2 foot, but with a factor to accommodate sea level rise. So that the system height was designed to accommodate sea level rise.
I remember asking at that meeting, very minimally so. Like, he admitted that with true
there are,
modeling,
as
it didn't
you
accomplish that.
can understand, there are many different models as to what the sea level rise will be. And depending on where you are on the shore, the sea level rise, the effectively sea level rise will be different as to whether or not a shoreline has a configuration where it's kind of like a funnel or not. But without getting into the details, the system was designed to accommodate sea level rise. Number 1. Number 2, the existing order identifies failure criteria and calls for removal of the system if the failure criteria is not if the system is failing or is so ordered. And as Stephen mentioned, that remains a reasonable condition to have. That that is consistent with Mr. Berman's comments about having the ability to remove the system if needed.
I just have a question about, Mr. Berman has suggested that maintaining a walkable beach in front of the system that's in theory, possible, but in the long term, unlikely. Part of the failure criteria in this says that we have to maintain a walkable beach, and I know that you're agreeing to that. Are you feeling that this will be able to maintain a walkable beach because it's such a long stretch, and the littoral system will sort of help keep that up rather than the mitigation sand?
Correct. As Mr. Berman mentioned, that the littoral system, the sediment in the littoral system is the primary sand source for the beach. Is the primary, source to down drift beach within well. The system is in terms of the entire eastern shore, Nantucket is a small proportion of that, about 7%. 0.8 of a mile for 10 miles of shoreline. So therefore, proportionally, the littoral system will provide the vast majority of sediment to the beach, to maintain the beach. Number two, the requirement and the use of the mitigation sand on the template to be distributed off of the template into the littoral system makes up for the sand of sediment that would have been contributed off of this reach of unprotected bank. The other, remember, the other 9.2 miles are unprotected and also contributing sediment. So this mitigation provides for the sediment to be contributed to the littoral system for this reach, because to make up for that. And we've seen from the annual reports that what's coming off the system exceeds on a length basis more than the adjacent unprotected bluff. And the reality is, for a couple of reasons, it's designed to lose the sand off the front. Number two, it's sand that was placed. We've mentioned this before. It's sand that was placed as opposed to a glacial feature. So it loses the sand more readily than the adjacent bluff does. So we, with that, we think that the littoral system and the sand will maintain a walkable beach for a good period of time into the future. Are we saying forever? I don't think anyone has that crystal ball, but for a long enough period of time, if we're proposing to do this, to provide benefit, both protection of homes and the public infrastructure, yes. And as the analogy that we provide in the letter is, someone who's, pursuing, cancer treatment. The idea is that treatment is seen as a benefit to that person for a good period of time. What does the future hold? We can't predict what the future will hold, but it's seen as for the applicants a benefit that will a project that will benefit them for a period of time that they see as useful.
A question about the delivery points. You guys made mentioned a lot about the importance of dumping sand at the delivery point during the 2018 storm, because it was the only way you could get down there. With this extended project, you have the capability, your delivery points, obviously the one to the south, will not. And do you have access to be able to dump sand right onto the beach now with this extended project?
Let me confer. I believe we have access on one of the ends where we go directly down to the northern end of the project. And then there's the other delivery point that end up on top of the system. If you dump enough, you end up with a bulge. Eventually, it would make its way down in front of the system.
Mm-hmm.
But the northern end would be ready to really put it right on the end of the system.
How much higher is the northern end from, say, the tubes? Is about 30 feet, 40 feet higher than the, actually probably even more.
Southern end is taller than the northern end.
Right, well, how about right now over the existing tube?
I'm sorry.
What is the elevation right now of the top of the bank at the existing?
The top of the template?
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, yeah, we have, I'm just wondering, I've been out in the end of that bank. That's really steep up there in the north. It hasn't stabilized yet.
Above sea level relative to
Yeah.
like 87 or 89.
Mm-hmm.
It's on the plan somewhere.
Yeah, it looks to be about 100 plus feet.
But
That is at the lighthouse.
I think it's closer
Yeah.
to 90.
Exactly.
It's tall.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, the average is about 70 feet. We did the calculation.
Yeah,
It's higher
it's higher.
than the southern.
I guess I kind of shifting gears a bit here, but I'm a little concerned about the northern part of the project. given that much higher height, but you still want to do the 5 tubes at the same elevation, I think it's like 30 feet. Do you realistically think that you can stabilize the properties on the ocean side of the road at that spot? Given the amount of slope that you can achieve?
Well, you know, I know one of the questions we had earlier was in terms of the fact that, you know, over the past 3 to 5 years, the shoreline has receded a little bit, but the design is to keep the tubes where they were designed originally, because rather than pulling the landward, because then you'd be maintaining that over-steepened bank. The reality is that that bank is over-steepened, you know, in terms of the angle of repose for the long term. Holding the toe stable, you might still get some erosion back at the top over time. Until that reach natural angle of repose.
Mr. Chairman, on file number 8013, which is Meadows 2, 8024 Sandpiper 1, and 8025 Sandpiper 2, this is their first request for lot releases.
Yeah, well, I
We've
question
had
that.
a lot of inspections and weekly meetings with our engineer, our staff,
Well, for
and
the
their team.
unfortunate
And
folks
they're
up in
making a lot
the
of progress
northern
there. We
end,
recommend
I
release
question
of the Form J.
whether it will save their properties, to be honest
I
with
would
you.
have to, I think, we're not design professional engineers, we'd have to confer with the board to, you know, give you, I think, the answer to the report. Okay.
But the relative impact at the toe of the bluff would be the same as we've seen so far, right? On the pilot project. In that instance, there's that one cottage up, what is it, 91? That was real close to the edge of the bluff, and so far so good. I mean, it could get any closer than that.
93.
No, Mr. Chairman, on this one, the next one,
The Goddeson's old
5316
property,
Sandpiper
93.
1 and 5416 Sandpiper 2, they
But
are
the property,
requesting a
the property
one-year
we just
extension.
permitted,
They're well
The other
within
emergency at the
the
top.
emergency
requirement
application,
for activating their permit.
which is a
However,
pre-78.
these 3 permits had a specific condition
Yeah.
that were tied
I
to
question whether or not this project
starting
will
the
actually
foundation
have,
work. So that's a bit unusual.
if it will be
And
effective
they've
for
certainly
protecting
started
that
other
property, in
work
which
at the
case I'm
site,
not
so we would
sure
recommend the 1-year extension as
the
requested.
purpose of it, to be honest with you. Unless you can, I mean, houses on the other side of the street are newer.
But the intent here, those houses are in the road.
I would just suggest the next stage, once that is.
No,
that geotube is
usually a
approved,
special permit is good for 2 years. That's now been changed to 3 years, and during that time frame, that's when they have to start the project. In these particular permits, we had a condition in the decision that said their vested rights started when the foundations
Yeah, I'm just,
are
well,
poured,
yeah, I'm just
so
concerned
it's
about
just a quirk of
affecting
these
this and that.
decisions, so it doesn't really affect the overall
Yeah, I mean,
time frame or
I
anything
think in
else.
previous meetings and with the first proposal, I mean, they said that the bluff is gonna hit an angle of repose, so. I mean, I think you're right to be concerned that when you look at the angle, that would
They
have
do
to
not have a
hit.
building permit yet.
It won't really be
They
effective at
recently
protecting those
filed a
properties.
permit to go to
Right.
the Building Code Appeals Board, for the
True, but we're
multifamily
also
units to get a
arguing that
waiver
these are
from some building
pre-78
code
houses that need to
requirements,
be
but I think those
protected, and
permits are
I wonder.
in the works.
At the
Maybe
present,
they
we're
are
about
mandated
50% of this
expand on
project doesn't even have houses on it, so
Now,
it's
the
close.
count that we looked at last time was of the extension project, I think it was 21 lots, 16 of which are at homes. Not including the existing project, but the 2.
Right, I mean, looking at the whole,
Make up this extension.
Are you talking about on the west side as well as the east side?
No, we're
Just
counting what
on the east side.
And I guess theoretically, there is a
And
plan
you,
for the road.
excuse me, you said 16?
I would have to go back and look at my letter to give you the exact number. I only got out of my memory banks.
Okay. Well, I certainly have a list that is much smaller, although SPPF is claiming 6 houses that they feel are entitled to pre-78 protection, which I don't agree. And so I only actually see the 3 houses between 115 and 109, a house 97 and 93, which were built in 54 and 51, 75 and 71, and then 67 through 59, although I don't see how you could argue they're in imminent danger. So that's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So, but 18, if,
When we did the count, we had 21 lots, 16 homes, 5 vacant lots. For the bylaw, it identified 14 homes as eligible with 378 structures, 2 are non-eligible. In terms of those being non-eligible, those gap lots. 5 are vacant lots, eligible for protection of protect the public infrastructure.
so there are 9 vacant lots, in fact, 85, 87, and 91.
I'm counting the project that's before us right now, which is 59 to 85, and then from 105.
Got you. Yeah, got you.
So we're not including the lots on the existing project.
Right,
Right.
okay.
Yeah, when I was mentioning, I'm looking at the whole picture. I was looking at the whole picture when I said 50%. But I know what you're saying.
These proceedings make it a little bit of a challenge with an extension project.
Right.
Parsing out
Understand.
what's the proposed project versus what's the existing project, and trying to keep those items in their own columns.
I understand. I do appreciate you not including the other side of the street, although you did in the beginning, but I understand. Thank you.
Through this correspondence, we've identified just those
Right.
easterly homes and the road.
I have trouble with the whole public infrastructure thing, because the whole thing that started this is to give the town time to move Baxter Road. That was the emergency order. And now we're hearing Baxter Road again, oh, we gotta protect Baxter Road again. It's like, I think Baxter Road, they played that card. If you're playing poker, and you try to play a card twice, you get shot. You know, and I think, I'm not saying we should shoot him, I'm just saying we should not let him play this card twice. I think Baxter Road is off the table.
Yeah, so I don't like to make it a habit of correcting or disagreeing with the commission members, especially since Ernie was mayor at the time. So we may have a different recollection, but I do want to say, just for the record, that there was not an order to move Baxter Road, but part of the things that we said we would do is look at whether or not there was a viable alternative here. And what has plainly factually been determined is there is no viable alternative. It's not as if you can just put a road on the other side and make that go away. And that's what we did. There is an alternative access plan in place that would allow it, if there was a breach, that there would be a northern access point developed at that point for emergency access, for those people. But there's no way to sort of replace the access in the middle and that infrastructure and just say, oh, well, the emergency's gone away. I wish it was that simple. It's just not. So I just feel the need basically every time to correct that it was never as if we just said, just give us time to fix this problem, and once we fix it, then it all goes away. It's repeatedly suggested by other people that this was supposed to be temporary, and once you fix that, then there's no imminent danger. The danger never goes away.
Well, Steve, this is perfect timing, because I have some questions for you. So,
Thanks,
but in fact, my understanding is that you could have alternative access for 115, 113, and 109, and that has been drafted, hasn't it?
Yes and no. There is an alternative agreement in place that allows for, if there's a breach, for there to be a access point opened up along the golf course. However, one of the criteria for that is that the permitting remain in place. So in other words, the failure of this permitting eliminates it's not essentially I'll give you a knife to cut my own throat scenario. That is only in the event of permitting being allowed and there being a failure. There is not. There is no scenario in which this commission would both disapprove the permit and the alternative access. If this exists in the project and the program has gone away. That offer is only on the table legally if there's a protection also.
I guess I didn't phrase my question correctly, because what I was asking you is it not true that the town has drafted plans to provide alternative access independently of this application?
No.
Because I've seen the plans, I've seen the drawings.
Well, yeah, I think what his point was it a stipulation that the selectmen made, that it's nixed if the project isn't
The town has to,
approved.
so Arkansas had to prepare those plans, engineer plans, at the request of the town, so that they would have essentially a shovel-ready plan
Right.
to go. Okay, and SBPF paid for that to happen as part of the MOU. But those plans can only be implemented if there are legal rights to take that land and do it. So either the homeowners would have to allow, or the landowners would have to allow that to happen, and one of the criteria for them allowing that to happen is that there's permitting in place for the protection. Or I guess the town could do a eminent domain taking, but the town has not
Right.
done that, nor do I really see that happening, because it would involve a significant financial situation that the town doesn't generally involved with.
Well,
The existence of those plans doesn't create the legal right to implement.
so moving on from that, I was sort of really surprised that after I went down to the building department and checked every lot and then presented to the Conservation Commission my analysis of those houses that were not entitled to pre-78 protection under our local bylaw because they'd had more than 20% added to them, that we had such a difference of opinion, which still seems to be the case. And so I just wanted to clarify that is it SPPF's position, for instance, that 77 and 79 Baxter Road
No,
are
the
still
additional
entitled
affordable
to
units
pre-78
were
protection?
negotiated through the final MOU with the select board. We think that's a win for the town
Well-
to have more units. The board does have to approve their location.
Because
There's a map
I actually would
in
like
your
a
packet
written
showing those.
response
I
to
think they're, you know,
my
reasonably dispersed, and we recommend
observation
you
that, like all the other houses that I've put on this list on both sides of the road, even though I don't see any of the houses on the west side of the road in any imminent danger, so I'm not sure why they're on your application. But on the east side, 77, for instance, in 1906 had, according to the building application, 555 feet added to it, although it looks as though the garage was added in those figures. But going to the GIS, the most recent GIS
The special permit
assessment map,
required certain configurations, so that may be
the
in
main
as a reference.
building, which does date back to 1940, is 720 square feet, while the application for the addition in 2005 was 200 square feet. So that far exceeds, in terms of the footprint, the 20% that that would normally be allowed under our local bylaw. So I would like, please, a written response as to why you think that it still is entitled to protection. And the same is true with number 79. And so I'm asking you to give me a written response to why you consider 1979 protected or allowed to be protected. In 1989, there was an application to add what was 466 square feet net to a 1,441 square foot footprint, which is considerably more than 20%. And then by 1997, when they were asking to actually add a deck to it, the square footage had gone up to 1,930. And according to the latest GIS, the square footage is 2,088, which is a far cry from the original 1,440. So,
So we can respond to you in writing. I will tell you, we did take a look at that, and I will give you some general answers. One of them is that I think we disagree on whether or not adding a basement when you move a house counts as 20%.
it's not adding a basement, Steve. This is strictly footprint.
Yeah.
And so I would like an answer to that.
Sure. In some of those cases, there was both area added and area removed, so that the proportion was different than just looking at the condition. And then also, frankly, SPPF takes the position, and this has been consistent in the filings, that bylaw is, that aspect of the bylaw we think is questionably legal, but we have consistently taken the position that it is under the state law, but that if the commission grants a waiver, that we don't need to worry about it. And in fact, if you go back and look at the order that exists today, the commission granted that waiver. So we have chosen not to argue about it. That's where I think we are.
And that waiver was granted on which house exactly?
As
You mean
carried
on-
out the project. I don't know.
But that waiver was granted on lots 97 and 93 under the emergency provision of protecting public infrastructure until the, and I was of the same opinion as Ernie, that it was temporary until the infrastructure, until the town came up with an alternative. So he and I happened to be in agreement, and so. But anyway, thank you for
We can
acceding to my
respond
request.
in writing, but I did
Thank
want
you.
to give you just a general
Sure.
idea that I think both of the math works, and also that there could be a waiver there that would deal with this, which you may or may not want to vote for.
Thank you.
And I know you said you had questions for me. Was that it, or?
Well, no, I mean, that's good enough, I think.
I had a question maybe for Jeff. Is CZM or DEP going to review this? Give us a review on this project?
CZM has not been requested to review. DEP to issue the file number obviously reviews the application for completeness. And if you read their comments, unless they have something very specific that they're looking for, don't always send it along. But I can certainly inquire to the section to see if they want to provide any comments in specific. But I know they try to, I mean, they're obviously the appellate board for a state appeal to not necessarily provide that, but we can certainly ask CZM if they're interested in providing comments.
I would like to. I mean, it was a major focal point on the primary project there now.
I mean, I know they've been providing copies, so.
Mr. Chairman, everything that we submitted to you, we have submitted a
Right.
copy to the DEP.
Yeah.
We don't have a person specific, so we have sent them hard copies by you.
Right. Yeah, I would personally like to see their comments on this because it was pretty pivotal in the last decision we made. So.
Sure, I can follow
Yeah.
up with Mr. Mahala and Mr. McKenna and see if that was something that they were planning on providing, or if they're not, there's reasoning. Have that pretty quickly. It's a pretty quick phone call to Bill to find out
Right.
what their plan is.
So, by way of background for anyone who's not familiar with this, the planning board opened the public hearing on their own initiative because there were issues related to the use of the property in the rear and the appropriateness or not of the roadway improvements that had been required of the board when it was supposed to be all residential. So the board opened the hearing. You did pursue some enforcement through the building division of Plus. And I think, what you wanted to accomplish has been accomplished. I don't really see the need for you to continue holding the public hearings or to render a decision at all. I think you could dismiss the matter without prejudice. There definitely are some issues with the landscaping, between the two property owners that will need to be addressed. But, as Mr. Kyberg mentioned, I think that is a civil matter for the two of them to work out. And if at some point in the future the board decides that you need to get involved in it in some way, you're still holding the rear lot, so you could, hold that until you're satisfied with the resolution.
Storm events that we've been hitting the exposed geotubes. As Mr. Berman mentioned, ways of not hitting the geotubes, no harm, no foul in terms of those not being covered. But so, during that month, we had 4 storm days, where the 4 storm events where the waves were hitting the exposed geotubes. That's that 1 month, which was probably the most intense storm of the season.
It's probably the most intense storm month of the last 5 years. Actually, since this project's been in place, it really was tested that one time, actually.
There's several storms that meet the definition of a major storm by the New Orleans Commission. And since it's been installed.
But a lot of them were not northeast winds either.
This was the first 3-day nor'easter since it's been. So when you say there were 4 days in
Well,
total,
The reviewer said there were 4 days.
well,
But,
yeah,
no, I understand.
right.
Yeah.
I would encourage people to go back to the record from the last hearing. This is, I think it's appropriate since it's a public record, but go back and dig up Jim O'Connell's comments about why it's so important to have sand being contributed during storms, why that is the critical time. And his comments are in there.
Right. Well, that was my point of being able to get material into this, dumping it on the beach during the actual event. And access would be difficult. I mean, yeah. Do we have other questions?
I just wanted to add a point of clarity, not to backtrack. But since it came up, I know we talked about substantially improved for that pre-78 qualification. So I just wanted to read it just so people had it in their brain. It's not just a 20% expansion, or it's cumulative expansion of habitable space greater than 20%. So I know there's been questions for additions and deductions, and I know typically and in the past the commission has viewed that percent change related solely to habitable space. So if you had non-habitable space that was removed and then you added some that habitable for habitable and on, typically we've always done it on similar structures as well. So if you have a completely separate structure and you remove, you know, your 120 square foot shed to add on to your building, that's not been kind of swapped. That's how we've viewed it in the past and kind of historically. So it's a little bit murky on how you figure it out, but that's kind of how we have treated it in the past.
So,
But if they would convert a deck
so
to
the
habitable
surveyor
space,
and the
then that would be an
engineer
increase.
for the property owner at the
Correct.
Because they go,
time
it's
proposed the
it's
layout,
structure, but the deck
and
is
it was
not
reviewed
considered
by Ed
habitable
Pesci.
structure.
and it is,
Correct.
you know,
So
fairly
that would
modest
still be
within
an
the full
increase,
layout. There is
not
a
just
swale,
for
there is a
increase
traveled
also.
way.
Correct.
And the
definition
fact that they
requires it to
cut
be
outside of the way is unfortunate, but
So if
I
you,
don't know
for
if that's
instance,
something
take
the
a
board needs
garage
to
and then make it
continue being
habitable,
involved with.
then you're adding to the habitable space. And there is one property there that's exactly what's happened. Although we haven't discussed it in detail this evening.
I just wanted to get that out there because I know
Yeah.
we don't deal with that a lot.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, so I'll open it up to the public. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Emily Molden for the Nantucket Land Council. Also with me tonight is Trey Rufin from Applied Coastal, and I'll have him come up to provide some comments for you momentarily. I just wanted to go over a few thoughts initially. We also read Mr. Berman's report and may have read some of his comments a little bit differently. But I put a few observations and thoughts down on paper for you today that I can provide for the record. I just thought I'd go over a few of them quickly and then ask Trey to make some more technical comments. Mr. Berman's report definitely emphasizes the importance of sacrificial sand, as has been discussed, and also the timing of its placement. And he does say quite clearly that it is in fact during storms when the availability of the sediment is most important in order to alleviate the negative impacts from the geotubes to the system. The continued natural erosion adjacent to the geotubes is going to cause ongoing planking and end scour. This is something else that Mr. Berman speaks about in his review, and that's going to make it increasingly difficult to maintain the beach fronting the geotubes as well over time, as has been discussed. And the commission
from the beginning, has conditioned the maintenance of this walkable beach. It's an impact that has always been important to this permit, and as was stated, your independent third-party reviewer basically said that the ongoing maintenance of a dry beach in front of this structure is infeasible. So we just ask you again to keep these points in mind. The impacts that I just listed that are immediately adjacent to the geotubes on the adjacent banks as a result of the flanking and end scour, and also in front of the geotubes when they're exposed, the additional erosion that takes place there, as well as the inevitable downdrift impacts to resource areas that will result from inadequate nourishment, which we still believe is the case with the adaptive mitigation program that's being proposed. All of these impacts basically add up to a project that isn't formidable. And one of the points that I just really wanted to raise is that the applicant continues to speak about their burden from a regulatory standpoint to demonstrate that the project they're proposing to you is using best available measures. And we disagree that that's their burden. The regulations, when you look at your regulations, especially your local regulations, require them to go much farther than just providing best available measures. They actually require that the project have no adverse impacts to the interests. And I just would really implore you to reread those performance standards and the waiver request that's being asked. Because it does require that the burden of proof to show that there'll be no impacts rests on the applicant. So as you move forward, considering an order of conditions, I know you've been hearing a lot about best available measures, but you just need to remember that they're actually
So
required.
a decision was circulated that was not fully agreed upon, so maybe in this situation, the best route would be to continue it for a month. Maybe we can finalize the decision so that it's clear for all the parties involved.
Good evening, Trey Richmond from Applied Coastal. Obviously, Steve and Dwight and Maria have a very different read of Mr. Berman's memo than I do. Kind of almost humorous with different viewpoints of each. But what I really want to step back to is back to like 2013. 3 of you were here for those hearings when we came up with how to go about this. And the whole idea, at least from my perspective, was that we had this 22 cubic yards on top. Whether that number was correct or not, that was debatable then. But the goal was that we'd have the sand on top of the system. A storm would come and erode it at the base, and the sand would actually, through gravity come down, so sand would always be available during a storm. What we're finding is that we're metering out sand at 2 cubic yards per storm, regardless of what the storm level was. And the idea is with a nourishment project, whether it's is that some years we're going to have less sediment coming off the bank, so it's going to have a lower storm year. Some years, like 2018, we're going to have a higher storm year, so we're going to provide more sand. And that's how the bank operates. And so the 22 cubic yards is we are expecting some years to be less, some years to be more. But when we're metering it like this, we never get the more, because we're only giving 2 cubic yards per storm. That's not originally how this was designed. And we talked about the 5 years of data learning and taking the best available measures coming forward. But from what I can tell, the only best available measure that we've learned is that we've now dropped the tow down to -3. There's been no adaptation to the mitigation plan. There's been no design changes to the structure. And I would think within 5 years you could come up with some ideas whether they would work or not. I mean, you could put more mitigation sand on the beach. So hence when we're worried about whether 22 cubic yards are coming off, it's actually on the beach during those storms to mimic that bank. Because the point we do agree on is that we're putting the system in to protect the bank behind it. But the mitigation measures are not for the properties that are behind it, they're for the properties adjacent to it. We're trying to keep them whole. Right? So if we're not providing that sand, we're not doing that. We're having an adverse impact. And we could talk about that this is only 7% of the entire coastline. However, the bluff is higher here. It's the most erosive piece of the bank. So whether it's really represents 7% or something more on the order of like 15 or 20%, we can argue those points. But think about it this way: would any of you guys notice in your paycheck if 7% just disappeared? My guess is you all would. So it's the same thing with a sediment system. If we take 7% out, it's going to notice. This also isn't a flush system. We're eroding. So we're already in a sand-starved condition, otherwise we wouldn't be eroding. So then we make it 7% worse. That's a significant impact. And we can talk about mitigating, and that might bring it back down to what, 6%. But we're having an impact. And we're not doing anything to design to minimize those impacts that we've learned over the last 5 years. We can talk about the coastline is not eroding any faster. However, I'm plotting up their data. This isn't my data. This is their data. It clearly shows that we are eroding faster if you look at that red line. And this has been provided before. Once again, this has happened. Their data shows this. So, a couple things that I think we need to talk about also is that we agree with the formula. If we're going to figure out how bank erosion, height, step back, the formula is only as good as the data going into it. We all can agree on the formula. But I think what we're missing is actually how fast is this bank stepping back to calculate that. I think the height of the bank, we can all agree on that. That's pretty easy, pretty measurable. But then erosion rate. I think if you look at the time period they're using both for the north side and the south side, this is the acceleration that is going on. Hence, we're under mitigating. We're taking a really long time span. And what I showed at some of the profiles is that, over 10 years of that period, the beach was actually treated, but we're including that time period in there. That underestimates the amount of mitigation that is required. We should look at what is actually occurring, because if you actually read the standards, the mitigation is not for what was going on in the past, it's what's going on now and into the future. And what we're going to see with a bank like this on Nantucket is that it's going to continue to accelerate. Our mitigation volumes over time are not going to decrease, they're going to increase. If they're going to decrease, we wouldn't need this project, right? But we do need this project if they want to keep their houses like that. So hence we should mitigate to protect our neighbors, the north and south, against that. We shouldn't have to force everybody to go to Ravenna just because this section was Ravenna. And we can talk about whether you're using the top of bank or being high water. Yes, and over time they will move at the same rate. We've argued about in the past that they didn't have to, but common sense rule about that. The one thing that's really nice about using the mean high water line is it's easily identifiable in a photograph, but it also is very quick to show accelerations. At the top of the bank, you have this, it'll steepen and then it'll slump off. But the high water line moves very rapidly. So that's the reason why most of the coastal scientists and engineers do use it. It's quickly identifiable. You can see the accelerations over a short period of time and over a longer period of time. That's why we use it. So we can use the top of coastal bank, but we need to actually look at the time periods that are important. And we should actually use mean high water, which is what I was plotting here, showing the acceleration, is that we are seeing acceleration. And hence our mitigation volumes should go up to reflect that. We can talk about whether we're having 3 times on top of the system. And that's only true if you actually believe the 8.8. I don't. I didn't before. I think if we look at the existing system, we're showing that we are actually giving off about 22 cubic yards. And that's actually at a metered rate because we're not giving off every storm. And the idea that, in March that we only missed 4 days, that's just look at their graph. So we have a storm on March 3rd. And then we have several days afterwards where the beach is inaccessible. And you can look at Mr. Bierman. The reason it's not accessible is your water levels are up. When your water levels are up like this, you're actually still eroding from the bluff that was available. This isn't going back on quiescent conditions where the base of the bluff isn't getting wet every day. These are the sections where they are getting wet. We give up the 2 cubic yards in front of the system immediately within a few hours of the storm starting, and then we go through the whole period where there's no sand coming off. That's not how this was ever dispositioned or designed or envisioned. We expected that 22 yards to continue to be available. So then we go on to the other storms. There's still no sand. I mean, if you actually count it up, my read is that there was about 21 days in March where there was no sand available. It's a little different than 4. And we can argue about that and end up somewhere in the middle. But the point is, we're not doing anything to make the system better. I mean, we've had 5 years. If this was really a pilot project, shouldn't we evolve? I'm not worried about keeping mitigation on top of the system in front of its houses. and worry about keeping mitigation from the houses north and south. That's really what you're trying to do, because if you're trying to prevent an adverse impact, you know, it's not these houses that are going to be adversely impacted, it's everyone else in the system, the other 93%. So you can talk about tax rates and all that, but it's the 93% we need to protect. So, I will provide written comments agreeing with Mr. Berman, disagreeing where I see fit, but I read this very differently than I do. I don't see that he is agreeing with their points on that their mitigation line is right. I don't see that he says putting out the sand at any time is great. He actually says a couple times in here how important it is during a storm to provide that mitigation. That's when you're going to anticipate radar. Sand offshore at that point is not going to anticipate that radar. That means our erosion rates in south are going to be higher because we're not mimicking the bank. Obviously, we can't mimic 100%. But we can do better than we're doing right now, which is within the first 2 hours, we have 2 cubic yards gone and then we're done. Let's worry about it for the next one. So I think we need to look at this in a different light, read it again, I'll provide comments, hopefully you guys will have time to read them. But thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah, sure. You gonna be here a while?
Yeah, it'll be a while. I can have medical stuff.
No, I.
Here's some.
Could you give your name?
I will.
Stranger. Gotcha.
Thank you.
My name's Dirk Ragavane. I'm an attorney and I'm speaking on behalf of the Quidnet-Squam Association. I spoke extensively with the prior application on this, but I've essentially just sat and listened for the last number of years, or months as this has been presented. The Quidnet-Squam Association is located to the north of this project. It is an organization of property owners both in Quidnet and Squam, and they have a coastal, large part of their membership has coastal properties, both on Sackage Pond as well as on the coast. And so they have a unique interest in this project because if this project, if the mitigation for this project fails, it'll affect their properties because they are downdrift of, to the north and downdrift of this proposed geotextile seawall. This letter they asked me to deliver to you. It was written by the commission. It doesn't have a signature at the bottom, board of directors. It was voted. I can sign it if you need to sign one. It was sent electronically as well directly to Jeff. And it addresses several issues that are of concern to the Quidnet-Squam Association. There are issues in this project that are not of concern, and that doesn't mean that they don't care, like the birds, bird habitat within the bank. Those things are a concern to everybody, and they impact everybody the same. They're trying to address the concerns that immediately would impact their property rights, their property losses, the kinds of things that sometimes you want to refer to as standing. They're raising these issues because they are hit differently by these issues than the general public that you all represent. There's just 4 points within the letter. They talk about, well, actually, let me back up before I say that. What their concern is their own coastal banks, and thus their coastal beaches, that protects their properties and then protects the Sackage Pond properties through the barrier beach. So this project, to the extent it will cause an impact, is one of their concerns. I mean, you put up a seawall, you start messing with the sand contribution, littoral drift and everything. So that is supposedly being mitigated. So you look at the mitigation, and then that's a question of how much, when, and in what style, and also security, that it will be there, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because once you put this thing up and if it's going to stay there, you need to look at it all the time. Sacajawea Pond, which they're particularly concerned about because when it did breach this past winter, it took out the road on the far side of it, and that's part of their access to where they live. And then just the pure scale of the project. In addition to what's in the letter, I wanted to address a few things. Mr. Steinauer talked about Jim O'Connell. He did so 3 of you heard his testimony. He's a coastal engineer, coastal geologist, I guess. And he gave expert opinion at the prior hearing, and I will try to dig that out from the old records at Jeff's office and then come back and resubmit it to you, because he did submit written analysis of the whole coastal area there. One of the things he addressed, though, and I think that's what Mr. Steinauer was referring to, was that during a storm, if you don't provide the nourishment into the storm right then, and then you create a seawall, and it starts reflecting off of the seawall, like we saw happen this past winter, spring. Anyways, it creates essentially like a divot. It's an erosion. It refers to it as an erosion cell. So you have an area which is sort of cut out. But if you watch over time, erosion cells then move. So you have the littoral drift coming north, for instance. We won't talk about what goes south. We'll talk about the northern, because that's where my client's properties are. But you can notice over time that an erosion cell will move along a beach, because that lack of nourishment moves along as the other stuff fills in afterwards. And the other point he made, and this is what's interesting also about this process, was that it's the actual sand being in there during the storm actually takes down the energy level of the storm. So if you have an eroding bank, and then you have the sand is churning around, I know you've all been to the beach at some point during these storms, and you look at the areas where it is eroding the bank, it's just like it's brown and it's full of just dirt out there. Well, all those little particles are dissipating the wave energy, and they're helping. I mean, they're moving along, and they're going to get redeposited, and they're moving out, and they're going to get deposited, and then come shore again and get redeposited during summer, beach buildups. There's all that dynamic going on. But one of the dynamics is it's actually dissipating the energy. When you have, right now, 900 feet of it, and I went there during one of the storms last time to watch, and it was pounding into the forward edge of the geotube, which essentially is a vertical structure. It was pounding in and out. And what's not going in then is all that sand, because it wasn't washing off the top of the geotubes, because they stepped back, and all that sand that might have been washing in was up on top of the different levels. What's called the template, which is kind of interesting, because the template is sort of a size and it has sand in it, but if all the sand is up at the top of the road, for instance, it wouldn't contribute. Obviously, if it's down on the beach, it would contribute. If it's halfway up on a ledge, it's going to contribute at a certain point when the waves get so high that they hit the ledge. But when we watch storms around here, and they talk about wave heights and 100-year storms, the wave heights are measured. I went back and was looking at it. The data for the wave heights was from the offshore buoys, which is government data and it's legitimate, but it was data that was assembled before the waves cross over the bar system that lies off Sconset. And you go to Sconset during a storm, and you see all these waves breaking out there. That's dissipating some of the energy. So you can't just take a direct wave height from an offshore buoy and say, well, that's how high the waves are going to be when they hit Sconset Bank, because everybody who's lived here their whole lives, you just know that's not true. That's not how high they go. It comes pounding in, but it's down low, and it never is going to get to those higher levels of the geotube bank. It just this, and we get to the, you'll see it tearing away. If we have another really good set of serious storms that pound away at the coastal bank and start taking it down, you'll see that there's still sand just sitting at the top of the coastal geotube array, even when the banks are going. So I think, I mean, the process of how this works is more complex, and, you know, than I think it's presented even here. The nourishment, just an issue that needs to come up. This is interesting, but I was thinking in terms of if you come in and you're going to have to take a piece of a wetland, and the mitigation, there's a multiplier in there, but essentially you have to build new wetland. I mean, I'm sure you've all had, we used to have projects, I'm sure you've had projects before you where you had wetland replication. Well, when people come in for wetland replication, they have to show what they're going to do, how they're going to put it in, how it's going to work, how it's going to keep working into the future, and all of that. You have to essentially assure that the replicated wetland is going in and then staying there forever, because you're destroying the one over here. One of the problems with the nourishment project that we have here is it's funded by Stockton Beach Preservation Fund, and they obviously have sufficient cash coming into their system to have done all this work that we've seen. But they're a nonprofit corporation which don't own any assets, and they don't have to keep existing forever and ever. So one might worry that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the money cap might turn off at Stockton Beach Preservation Fund, and there won't be enough money for, like, what's now proposed 4,000 feet long mitigation. And then what happens? Does the town take it over? Is there a betterment district? All these ideas have been floated around, but they've never been finalized in a way that we can assure that there'll still be sand being put into the system 20 years from now or 30 years from now. And I think it's imperative that you do that, because if somebody came in and said, well, we're going to replicate the wetland, you say, how are you going to do it? And say, well, just you know, trust us, we'll do it, or the town will do it later on, or, you know, you can keep kicking that forward, and it's not realistic. So somehow securing the mitigation into the future, I think, is something that you guys need to look into, and either from the applicants, from the Board of Selectmen, and then work into your order. Well, there was a lot of talk about, you know, mean high water, mean low water, and all that kind of fun stuff. And all of that's good for measuring stuff, but, well, you know, distances of erosion, coasts, and everything like that. But the people, both to the north as well as the people in this project area, are more concerned about the top of the bank than anything else. They don't care where mean high water is nice,
Mr.
but
Chairman,
it's down
the
there,
special
and they don't
permit
want their house
allowance
down
for
there
a
with
garage
it. And the
on
neighbors
an
to the north
adjacent
don't want their
residential lot
houses
is
down with it either.
relatively new.
When
The board
the
discussed
nourishment
it quite a bit,
fails
I
during
think, at
system,
the
it starts to
time,
carve out
and it was
the
to
north,
allow
big
this
divots.
very thing,
It's taking out
and
bank.
for the board to have an
You can come back
opportunity
after the
to
storm and
see
compute
how
all
is
the
it going
sand
to
that
be
went
used,
into
and
it
is it
and
really going to fit
resupply
in with
the
the
sand
residential
back into the
neighborhood or
template.
not. And I think
But
in
that
this
sand's not going to go down the
case,
coast
you know,
and
as
then
Attorney
slide
Brescher
back up
said,
and
the
reform
site
the
is
coastal bank
really
again.
constrained
It's
with
once these
wetlands,
banks of road, they're gone
septic,
forever, which is,
fields
obviously,
and wells and other
SBPF knows that.
things.
Well,
And
that's
the
true for
building
the neighbors
envelope
to the north
for
and
the
south as
proposed
well.
garage
Those of you who went
doesn't
by,
seem to be
you know,
that
the Sankaty
large.
Golf Club, you can
It's
see
going to be
the way
subject
their
to
bank goes. And it's
HDC
not like saying, oh,
review.
that's right, we'll put
So I
more
think if
sand
the
out
board
in
wants
the
to put some
system and somehow
conditions
build our pool
about,
back out.
you know, the use being
onto the
related
beach
to
now.
an adjacent property
not
or
how it
something
works.
like that,
So
that's totally reasonable. But I
this-
think the
the
you know, getting into
mitigation
the details
has
of
to
the
be
site
sufficient
plan, you know, it's
to
going to have to meet the
minimize
zoning
or
requirements. So I don't
prevent
think
the,
that's something that you need to be too concerned about at this stage.
erosion of the banks to the north and the erosion of the banks to the south. And then again, just two more things. They're concerned that the project, in order not to impact it to the north, that it not be overly large. I mean, obviously DEP has said in the last superseding order of conditions from the first project that specific houses were allowed to protect themselves. And they actually denied certain things that were asked for by SBPF last time around.
The idea would be to
like
close the
adding
public hearing
tiers
and approve or
to
not
the
the special permit
properties,
to allow them to proceed with
that
a
didn't have
residential
houses on them,
garage. So they still
because,
need HDC approval, and then
I will
after
cut it
that,
out.
after the appeal period is over, they can get their building permit.
I mean, you really should read the state's superseding order of conditions for the existing project, because it cuts it up and hashes it out, and it says, well, you can, we'll allow the 3 that were put in for emergency purposes on the lots with infrastructure while the town relocates the infrastructure. And it looks at, and then it says, and then this house and this house and this house, they're entitled to have it because they're pre-78 houses. And then it says, in the future, individual houses, the word is buildings under the State Act. It's not houses, it's not infrastructure, it's buildings. But it says individual buildings can apply if there's no reasonable alternative, and if they meet the criteria. For instance, the houses that are on the obviously west side of the road, which have been sort of sometimes included in this project in terms of the larger maps and everything, they're outside Concom jurisdiction. They're so far back from the top of the bank, so clearly they're not threatened. But what the state did is it looked at it lot by lot, and I think the commission's going to have to, in order to give an order of conditions, analyze lot by lot. I mean, you're going to have to essentially make separate findings for each lot, saying this lot has no building on it. This lot, and therefore is not entitled to protection. This lot has a building on it. It was built so-and-so. It has not been expanded. And we've got the evidence to show that out of the building department. So this one would be entitled to a geotube. And then you're going to get like little pieces of geotube down the coast. But the idea that you can then say, well, the others are just gap lots and we'll just fill it in too, isn't consistent with the way the law's been applied. Gap lots are usually very small places in the middle of a larger structure, like a small gap in the middle of a larger structure where it's better to make the gap. Here we have actually not that many properties that are entitled to protection, and what they're doing is saying, well, they're big, we have a little geotubes, but the gap lots are going to be really big, and they need to be filled in too. So I think you need to do a lot-by-lot examination. And then the other thing that comes up sometimes and needs to go into your concerns for order conditions is failure criteria, because the criteria are in there, but the question is, what do you do if this project fails? Well, it has to be taken out. How? I know they have an escrow account to do it, but you're going to sell Wisconsin Beach Preservation Fund. We'd like you to tear out this geotube structure now, and that's going to cause increased erosion on the top, and the bank may actually be totally unstable once this thing is removed because it's actually slid down on top of it. And do they need to file a notice of intent in order to do that? That's work on the beach. So this is like 5 years from now, it's failing. Okay, so the orders, they've got a certificate of compliance because it was finally put in right and everything else. Now it's failing. Do they have to file a notice of intent to take it out? Does the town have to file a notice of intent to take it out? Can the Concom order it? Can you just directly order it? What's to ensure that, the people who own the houses at the top of the bank say, hey, we like this. I know it isn't working anymore, but it's protecting our house. They're going to go to court to block any kind of government attempt to remove this. This whole idea that, well, it will be removed in the future if it fails, doesn't really look at the reality of how that would work. And I don't know whether it's through town council or town government or the applicants or everybody working together. I think you guys need a better picture. I think the whole island needs a better picture of how that would work. So that's all I got right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Dirk.
Thanks, Dirk.
So real quickly, just to help out, not to deny Dirk a trip down to the office. I'll move them up on the page, but on our Baxter Road filing information page.
Can you speak in the microphone?
Oh, sorry. So on that Baxter Road filing information page that we get all of our submissions on, if you scroll down, and since he referenced them, I'll move them up to this one. The Jim O'Connell letter from 2013 and the superseding order are both available on that page if you go down far enough, but I will make sure that they get added to the current filing as well to make it a little easier to find. So, but they are there. It's the beauty of literally posting every document and just leaving it there for forever.
Other questions?
I can make them up right now. Perfect.
Deanna Atherton, Nantucket Coastal Conservancy. We have several comments and we will submit them in writing, but mostly I just wanted to respond to the assertions that were made about the original submission for this project, that it was a pilot project. I sat through the entire hearings. I never heard the word pilot project. And I have brought up on my computer, and I can give you hard copies of the title page of the application, and it says Baxter Road Temporary Stabilization NOI Submission. So this project was, see, temporary NOI submission, temporary, no pilot project, no revisionist history. So it was presented to the commission and it was permitted as a temporary project. So I just think that that's a matter of fact and we shouldn't be even discussing it, and comments to the contrary should really be taken for what they are. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. Other questions? Questions? Was there another one? Oh, go right.
So my name is Rick Atherton, and I live on Squam Road, so there's no question about that. But I just have sort of an observation, not so much a question. And it seems to me the material provided by Applied Coastal made quite clear that in front of the current geotubes, the water line is eroding faster than it did before the geotubes. And it just, there it is. So to me, that's an adverse impact of the geotubes. And I ask you to look ahead 5-10 years, and if it keeps eroding at those rates, I assume the water line is going to get within what? 2 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet, unless enough sand is going over to maintain that like a beach nourishment project. And that's not what this is. So to me, the beach is part of what you ought to be protecting as well as the bank and the homes up on the bank. And I found, just in my simple way of looking at this, that the Applied Coastal comment about a revised beach nourishment project, it was on page 2 or 3 of their letter, was an interesting one. And every time you look at the alternatives for this project, beach nourishment is just taken off the table, because the prior beach nourishment was beach nourishment gigantic. It was set up to only come in with sand, what, every 5 or 10 years. Right now, we're already putting sand over the edge. It seems to me that you've got to think about this in that way. How do you get enough sand in the system to protect the beach? Because I don't think the data shows that that's what's going to happen. They say it's going to happen. The data doesn't suggest that's the case because the beach continues to erode. So I just want you to consider that as you move forward, because something has to give, and the beach should not be the only thing that gives.
Question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's Ted Giletti. I'm a resident in Nantucket. Just wanted to ask a few questions. Has the Conservation Committee done or considered engaging coastal studies? I think they're in Providence or Provincetown to do a around the island sediment transfer project to get a benchmark understanding of how sand is actually moving.
I can tell you that that is something that the town is actively looking at, developing a sediment budget for the island.
Because having met with these people, it certainly sounds like something that really needs to be done before you get too far along
on considering to expand this temporary project. A question also is that, does the granularity
So, Mr.
of the
Chairman,
sand make a
the issue
difference?
I think that's really before you
For
tonight
example,
is not
the
about
kind of
the
sand that's
loading or
being
whether people
put
should
over
be
the cliff
parking in the
in
spaces that
Wisconsin
don't
now,
quite meet
is
zoning
that the
or
right
Branson's way.
size?
But
Is that the
it's,
right
have they
kind of
provided the
granularity?
off-site parking
But
that
that's a
was
question I've
required
heard
in their special permit
raised
condition
in
in
the past with people
2007
with whom I've
to
spoken.
go from 48 seat, or excuse me, from 28 seats to
And
48 seats.
furthermore,
And that
what is the
decision
long-term
required that a
strategy
lease or some type of
of
agreement
Concom
be made with a property owner within 500
respect
feet
of
of the site to provide at least 6 parking
extending
spaces.
the temporary
And
nature of a project like
some time ago,
the
you
one
all
which we're
actually
discussing
decided to
now,
proceed with
SPPF?
enforcement action because that wasn't being done.
Is the
And then
intention
the
to
business
ring the
went
island?
away and nothing came of it.
Or
So,
how far are
you
we
know,
going?
now we have a new business owner
What's
who
going to be
wants
the
to
impact?
start her business there, and the
And
Board
who's
of
gonna be
Selectmen
paying
have
for
said
it?
that they won't release the liquor license
Just
until
recently,
you say that the decision
in respect
is
of another
being
comment
complied
that
with.
was made in terms
So
of the
I personally
scouring
have
at
not
either
seen
ends of the
any written
geotubes.
agreement or anything.
A few weeks ago, I happened to go to the bluff where I witnessed that there was tremendous amount of scouring at the southern end of the geotube. And I'm not an expert in geology or land movement, but I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, the clay foundation of that cliff has been severely damaged as a result of the scouring.
So,
So as
so if
that's
that complies
continuing
with
to
the
happen,
exact
what
language in the
next?
2007
Are
decision,
we
then,
damaging the actual
I
structural
think
foundation of the bluffs
that's what the board was
themselves
supposed to
with
discuss
this
tonight.
scouring? And can that be remedied at all, or if not, what should be done? And I don't know if you've been discussing these points or not in the past. I haven't been a participant in these meetings, but I definitely wanted you to think about it if you hadn't already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Other questions? Any other questions from the commission?
I guess I get back to the same question about the future. And again, that's in our 8-page letter from the third-party reviewer is, you know, it's evident in, you know, by 40 years, there will be no dry beach. The road will still be threatened. What's the goal here? Is it 10 years? You know, 15 years this will last? And I looked back in my notes and it says there's, from Mr. Gordon, who presented on October 1st, I think, a 1-foot safety put in for sea level rise. So again, when I look about future planning and what they're trying to protect, I question adverse impacts that are going to happen sooner rather than later. So,
Jeff, did we ever have an independent estimation of what it would cost to take these things out? Especially if they start to decompose and, you know, they're trying to clean up shreds and stuff. I think that could be onerous, quite expensive.
So the way we've dealt with that before is, and the most recent iteration that we've dealt with that is to require kind of a yearly estimate for the complete removal of the structure, and then escrow or bonding to cover that amount based upon that estimate for removal. It's what we've done most recently for projects. That being said, I mean, we don't typically have a proposed 4,000-foot structure to deal with, so that's probably the way we would go, would have that part of that yearly updating to include an estimate for its total removal.
I guess also I question, will it be feasible to remove? You know, if the bluff does collapse on top of it, are you going to need excavators that are kind of below the mean high water line trying to excavate out to remove the old geotube bags? Or once it's buried and lost in there, it's just buried and lost in there?
Well, any other comments on that? Yeah, I mean, I think there's too many unknowns, and especially when you look at sea level rise, and a lot of different numbers out there, and it's hard to get an actual. And time frames, I think, is anyone's guess. But well, if there are no other questions, would you folks like to ask for a continuance?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we will, take, request a copy of the notice from tonight's meeting, that copy submitted. Provide responses to the comments and, continue the hearing.
All right. So to that, just to let everyone know, everything that was submitted tonight, we might reach out to a couple folks to get electronic copies, but we'll make sure everything is up, and all of the, I hate to say it this way, but all of the regular participants usually get emailed copies of stuff when they come in, so we'll make sure you guys get copies. So as far as continuing dates, sorry, my calendar decided not to work. So next Monday,
Mr. Chairman, if I may,
we don't
we have a
certainly have to
meeting
do on
scheduled
Mondays,
for
but
Thursday,
this one
the
we have been doing it.
21st.
Next Monday is
So that
a
may be
holiday,
good compromise to give
and then
everyone
the
a little more
following week
time
after
to
that
review
is
it, but not
school
wait
break.
until the next
I
regularly
know I will be
scheduled
away
meeting.
that week. I would imagine there'll be others that are away. Actually, we'll have a well-earned vacation. And then the next time, I know for a fact we have this room specifically scheduled on the 11th of March. I don't know if we're trying to get to it sooner or later. We can try to bring up the calendar to look at rooms. This room seems to work okay at this point. So that's a date that I know we have for sure. So that would give everyone time to get submission materials in if people want to. I may just suggest, if we could, you guys could try to do it if
You say May, do you mean March?
March, yes, March the 11th, is kind of looking back at the calendar and knowing that that's essentially 4 Mondays away. If we could try to set a deadline for initial comments to be kind of 2 weeks away, and then responses due the week before that hearing, that would be nice, that we don't get into the situation like we have tonight where, and I know part of it was because the third-party review came in and we had a response to that, and then people wanted to respond to the response. But if we could get all of that documentation in 2 weeks, and then give everyone a chance to respond in the following 2 weeks, that would then hopefully not lead to getting information essentially at the hearing. So to go, if we're going to use the 11th as the date, sorry, I'm just trying to read my minuscule dates here. I think if we could have, today is the 11th, have comments in by the 1st for the first round of comments, and then secondary comments would be that following week would be the 8th, if possible. And then that would give everyone a chance for the 11th. So first wave, does that make sense to everyone on the board? Does that seem like a good plan to you guys? The first round, trying to get the responses from tonight's hearing in by March the 1st. So that would give everyone this week, it would essentially give everyone 3 weeks to get that in. And then 1 week for responses to comments that come in. So it would be the 1st and the 8th with the hearing on the 11th. Same time, 4 p.m. where we're sitting. That misses the holiday and then school break. And then I'll be sure Poochie's here. Would you guys like Mr. Berman here for that as well, if possible? Would that be helpful?
He's available.
All right. I'll try to get Greg here for that day as well. I'll have to pony up some Highline tickets for him.
Just as a point of information is, and I'm waiting for final confirmation from Jason Bridges, the chair of the select board, but the select board is scheduling a discussion on March 13th about various issues that they have raised related to this project that are contained in a memorandum, and maybe I will send it to you if you haven't seen it. But it has things that the town has to deal with, such as liability analysis if project expansion is denied and how the cost will be paid, how the cost will be paid if the road fails and or the alternative access agreement is invalid, impact on island infrastructure for sand deliveries, impacts of where sand will come from. So it's not issues directly within your purview, but it should be of interest to you, as it certainly is for us. And we've been advocating to have this discussion in public, so we're very pleased that it's going to be scheduled.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Actually, I have a question for Art. You weren't here when I was asking. Could it be possible for the next meeting to get a profile of the northern part of the project with given the elevation of the top of the bank? And I mean, yeah, one of my concerns is the ability of actually getting a stable slope on that northern part of the project, given, mean high water and the.
Are you talking about a cross section?
Yeah, I mean, would it be possible? Yeah, across sort of a something, kind of give so something. Yeah, the cross section. I mean, right now you have the pictures of the structure, and then the bank kind of rattling off. But yeah, I'm just curious of what kind of slopes we're talking there. I know that Art, you've been doing work up there.
If I may,
Please.
Chairman, I would just say that it may be best coming from Gordon and Epsilon with the topography that they've already prepared that's consistent with the entire application. So we can discuss that.
Yeah, just because I knew you were working on that project that we approved, and that you had some up-to-date info on that.
I would simply say you're looking for a cross section of that northern area.
Yeah, I'm
they'll
looking for a cross
work
section.
out where that's coming from.
The project plan didn't do a couple of cross sections in the northern section, a couple of cross sections in the southern, but I'll talk to Gordon.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Thanks. Okay, so if there's no other questions, we'll continue till March 11th, tentatively.
No, we're continuing to March 11th.
Yes.
But it's not a
Continuing
tentative
till
date.
March 11th. Well, I have a question mark next to that one. So. Okay, thanks everybody for coming.
You will be here on March 11th.
If people have questions about those deadlines or when that stuff is due, feel free to contact our office and we can help remind and facilitate stuff getting in.
That's right. And make sure I come to the meeting.
Yeah, everyone adds to this.
Can I bring snacks to that one too?
We'll assign snacks to someone else.
You want pizza? Okay. Do we have other business?
No, not really.
No. Okay. Well, since we don't have. Oh no, that won't. Happens to everybody. Well, mine was clicking away
All right,
too.
if you guys want to do a motion to adjourn, that would be fine.
Okay. Do we have a motion to adjourn? Good. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank God.
All right, thank you guys.